We've had this speech today. Just generally, what's your takeaway from it? What do you think?
For me, that was one of the worst speeches by a Labour leader in a long time. Jeremy Corbyn was a terrible orator, but at least I felt like he was telling me the truth and what he really thought. I don't know what it is with Keir. He's not a great orator at the best of times. He speaks in riddles as if he's playing a role in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It took him 12 minutes to get to the 6 sort of missions and the things that he wants to do. Saying, who's he speaking to with this sort of stuff? Contracts with the people. It's like ripping plaster out of a wall with damp in it and all you've got is a hairdryer. Constantly going back to country first, party second. You're not speaking to the party membership anymore. You're speaking to the country. Joe Bloggs at home is going, what's he talking about? Tearing down the walls of Whitehall. 95% of people don't even know what Whitehall is in this country. They're not involved as much as me and you are. Talking about productivity stats, just say it's all fallen off a cliff. It's totally obvious why politicians like Nigel Farage are cutting through, are gaining momentum, are gaining support, because at the moment we have politicians on all sides who sound like politicians, and we're currently living in a climate where people don't speak plainly. The Tories and Labour sound like politicians, and Nigel sounds like something authentic, something believable. Now, I don't think he is at times authentic. I think he masquerades as a workers' champion. I don't think he is necessarily for the working man, but he cuts through in what he says. I think the one thing that I couldn't believe, this country hasn't become radical ideologues. We are a country full of pragmatists. What does that mean? What does any of it... It felt to me as a speech to journalists and you know, Westminster, really, when you should be speaking. And actually, the missions themselves, don't get me wrong, great idea to get rid of fastest growing economy in the G7. People don't care or know what the G7 is. I think to say better living standards in every part of the country, great, straight, understandable, people get it. Britain rebuilt with 1.5 million new homes, great, people get it, get them on the ladder, get affordable housing, safer streets. People don't feel safe. Police won't even go and find your mobile phone if it's been nicked, or your bike or whatever. They haven't got enough of them. Best start in life for every child. Who's going to argue with this sort of stuff? This is good. But then he says people think this is, might think it's too radical. I think we can be bolder. I don't think it is radical. This is Tony Blair rehashed. We can do more.
How's it? So you say this because, like you say, with the high living standards, I think that is a smart move. I think when I hear Westminster politicians, and I heard my own party do it time and time again, oh, the fastest growing country in the G7, all this lot. Like you say, Joe Bloggs on the street doesn't give a monkeys, to be perfectly frank. When we were battling off, oh, we've grown faster than Japan, France, people are like, whatever, mate. Like, I don't see that in my everyday pocket. But I do think Starmer's going to come unstuck here when the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, themselves have said that living standards are going to only go up, by their predictions, by 0.5% year on year. That's really not going to be enough change for people to really think that Labour have done anything revolutionary, like you say, anything bold enough to make them think, I'm going to give these guys a go again. And I think the Conservatives fall into the trap of believing somehow that this is all good for them and that there's something to be picked up. And I'm with you. The two-party system, I think, is crumbling before our very eyes. And I think that if Labour and Conservatives don't get their act together and understand the language of the working man and woman in this country and the issues of the working man and woman in this country, your Green parties on the left, your Reform on the centre-right are going to hoover up disenfranchised, disenchanted voters across our great nation. And I think we're going to see a very different-looking parliament. I mean, there's a clip that I'd like to come to where Keir Starmer's, again, talking about what he's inherited. I just think after 6 months, people will think, you're now in charge, mate. I don't want to hear about the past. I want to hear about the future. But let's hear what he has to say.
Broken, but not beyond repair. Because one thing the British people do know in their bones is that this is a great nation. No matter how tough things are for their family and their community, they know that. And they're right. Because they recognise it in themselves. After all, in the last 14 years, they tightened their belts when they were told, we're all in it together. They closed ranks to defeat a deadly virus, and they never once wavered in their commitment to stand with Ukraine.
I've got to be honest, Matthew, I was kind of nodding off. there. Again, like you say, I don't... What's he saying?
Utter middle-class waffle, because he then followed that with, look at the infrastructure in this country. It is clear we have long freeloaded on the British genius of the past. Why are you not just saying, we are all sick of seeing boarded up shops in town centres, painting the picture that people understand? It's almost like he's speaking in an academic arena.
Do you think it's panic?
I don't think it's panic. I mean, you could maybe point to the speechwriters, but really I think genuinely at times it is a man without a vision, because he's a man without any real solid politics. I think every scintilla of him is focus grouped to every corner of his being appears to be focus grouped. And they think they're saying things that people want to hear, but they're not speaking in a language that people understand. And actually, you had the same issue. It's not quite the same country, but you look across at America. I think you can get away with being more liberal on things that you might not at the moment if people trust you in other areas. And because of that, you've got to make people feel better. So it doesn't matter if productivity is going to be slightly down on what was forecasted previously, because if you can ensure that people have got money in their pockets, or that inflation is under control because you've borrowed less, or whatever else you want to do, or people are actually getting on the housing ladder and going, do you know what, it feels a bit better around here all of a sudden, or there's more police, or they're investigating crimes, you can get away with a few more immigrants coming in because people aren't seeing it. And the other thing is changing what people view. If you can stop those channel crossings, doesn't matter how many people are coming in legally, because people won't notice it as much, because every day they're turning on their TV, and you can see why people feel disenfranchised. We were sold Brexit as a silver bullet for our borders, and we will control our borders, this is what's going to happen. And people turn on the telly and they'll go, it's worse than it ever seems to have been before.
Well, it's one of the things I'm most ashamed of in 4.5 years. The Conservative Party absolutely lost control. I thought when Keir Starmer said that we were running an open border experiment, it hurt me to hear that from a Labour politician and not be able to disagree. And I totally understand why Kemi wanted to avoid the topic at BMQs, because ultimately it's one of the most shameful records I can think of, when we made so many promises over so many different leaders over 14 years and failed. And actually, I think Keir Starmer was criticised for not actually having immigration or migration as a milestone, but he did address it in his speech. And let's hear what he had to say about what it is that he intends to do on this topic.
As ever, that shows the argument. Take these statistics that were published last week, which revealed with total clarity how the Tories lost control of immigration, opened the borders deliberately to cover up the extent of their economic stagnation. Zero regard for the damage to trust in politics. Absolutely unforgivable. Now, this government will reduce immigration, legal and illegal, because that is what working people want.
Do you know what I would have done, Matthew, if I was Kemi and he was pushing, obviously, to have that immigration ban? I would have gone to him, listen here, mate, you're the one in the Brexit referendum who wanted to retain free movement and actually ran on that pledge as leader of the Labour Party, which will become leader of the Labour Party. You're the one who was signing letters that kept foreign national offenders on this country who went on to commit other crimes. You're the one who's allegedly, from your own insiders, looking at doing a deal with the EU which means free movement for under 30s. Now, whether everyone agrees or disagrees with that, I'd have said to Kemi, if I was Kemi, I'd have said, I'm not taking lectures on immigration from you either, a plague on both our houses. I've already said, sorry, you should do the same thing too, as in a way of punching back. Do you think Labour's got a credibility issue with immigration? Do you think Labour can ever really be a party of secure borders? I look back in the past and I think, actually, you know what? If you had David Blunkett, I could really believe it, but I don't see David Blunkett in this current cabinet.
I think it will remain to be seen. Labour have always, unfortunately, been tagged with the idea that they're soft on immigration or borders and whatever else. One thing I will say, despite the waffle that Keir spoke today, I was shocked, actually, and surprised, and thought it was probably a good thing electorally how he challenged the immigration figures in his speech last week. I think for two reasons. Morgan McSweeney will be well aware that reform are the larger threat to Labour at the next election and in the locals. And also because it's unsustainable, and if you don't tackle it early. But I thought he was actually quite convincing, Keir. He seemed genuinely
really,
quite...
Matthew?
Well, from what I've seen of him over the years, I thought, how will this play...
This man doesn't believe in border control.
No, so me and you know this. Now, will, you know, Joe and Jane blogs at home, who only really watch the news at 10, They vote at election time, but they're not as tuned in as me and you. They're not going to necessarily know his history of second referendum wannabes and having open migration and whatever else he promised in his leadership bid originally. And I thought, I just wonder if there's a way of him stopping the channel crossings, people aren't seeing it, you can sell that on the doorstep. You can tell, and people go, OK, yeah, and they're not noticing the same level of cultural change that they are at the moment. The problem he's got, though, and I keep saying this, and I'm really worried it's going to come down the traps when me and you are old and grey, is we look a lot at the numbers, right, with immigration. And my thing with immigration is, I'm quite liberal with it if we've got the infrastructure. We're not going to be able to catch up, so we're going to have to look at maybe restricting elements of it. But I think we need to look at the proportions more than the numbers, because in the 80s, we had 4 working people for every 1 pensioner. It's now at 3 and very close to 2. The more that we try and restrict at the moment, because failures from all governments of all sides to not train our own people, to restrict people's access. We now have doctors and nurses paying to do uni degrees rather than getting them chucked through and straight back into the NHS and having them sign something that you do a certain amount of years in the NHS rather than buggering off abroad, using apprenticeships well, and rather than certain companies using the apprenticeship levy to put people through training courses and not really doing things properly. We've not invested in our own people enough. So at some point it's going to be 1 for 1 and we're not going to get a pension, and we've not got enough people in the country paying into the tax system. And that's why I end up coming back to the idea that sounds very liberal and wishy-washy, that unfortunately until we get to that point, which is going to be long-term 20-year plan of all governments of all stripes, we're going to constantly need quite high levels of immigration. And on that one, because of that, you're going to struggle with public services, you're going to struggle to get in your GP, you're not going to be able to get on the housing ladder, you're going to have a homelessness crisis that's still going on. And I don't see how it gets better, because immigration is the little hot potato that nobody wants to have a real grown-up, and I hate when people say this, but a real grown-up discussion of, we might have to suffer, if you want to use that word, a little bit of this for a bit longer, until we get enough people through of our own.
You know me, Matthew, I agree with you. I'm willing to defend capitalism all day long. What I won't defend is corporatism, and corporatism has been about taking advantage of the shortage occupation list, where you get a third discount on the wages by bringing people abroad, by allowing these people, big companies, to not invest in their staff appropriately, or when they do, they use the levy in ways that isn't designed to actually help those 16, 17 to 21-year-olds, in particular, in places like Stoke, in places like Greater Manchester, I know you know well, into work, into skilled occupation, ultimately to feather their own cap. And I think it is, and I agree with you, reform must be sitting there licking their lips. There is a huge opportunity, and I think I'd love to get your view today. I know it's only one poll, but one poll has shockingly suggested that the Conservatives are ahead, with Reform second and Labour third. I mean, it's a real outrider, and it is one poll, and we are at least 4 years away from a general election, I would suggest. But is that something that should worry Labour politicians at this time, or do you think it's just, let's focus on what we're doing, like you say, deliver on the things that we're promising, and ultimately we'll get the benefit of that down the track?
Of course it should, because I said on election night on a different channel that Nigel Farage will be Prime Minister in 5 years, and people laughed at me. Now people seem to be coming round to the idea that he could easily hijack the Conservative Party, or that it becomes one party, or he ends up in the shadow cabinet, or whatever way they want to deal with this. Because if Kemi Badenoch looks at this and goes, I've still got a polling crisis, we might be on 25%, but so are Reform, and actually if we join forces we'd totally win a majority. Is she willing to do that, to potentially be moved out the way? Because there's no way Nigel's going to play second fiddle to anybody, as we know. So all of a sudden he's in charge. And the problem is, Labour was a very large protest vote, how they got into government. I was knocking on doors the same as you for different sides, and everybody hated Keir and hated us. They just hated your lot more. Yeah. And actually what I saw over the weeks that came is more and more people actually turning towards Reform. If we'd have had a 12-week general election, I think they'd have done even better, because they were seen as an alternative. Now, if we've promised change, and all we've had at the moment is donor stories, free clothes, winter, your grand's freezing at Christmas time, the farmers are going to go bust and we're not going to have any food, where are we going to find ourselves? Will Reform are the real change? You seem like you're junking a lot of promises. And I think Kemi Badenoch's in a very tricky position, because the Tories have lost all credibility on loads of things, because they failed over 14 years objectively, because people feel worse off than ever and immigration's the highest it's ever been, so they can't even come with that charge. And I thought it was very odd of her to go on the Louise Haigh stuff on Wednesday, which for me is a total Westminster story. Nobody's ever spoke about it that I know outside of Westminster. And actually, to give credit to Keir, he learned from the mistakes Boris Johnson made during the COVID era and dealt with it there and then.
Do you know what I'd done if I was Kemi? Every PMQs, I'd have 6 pensioners sat up in the public gallery and say, here's June, she's X age from X area, and she's up there, I've met her this morning, she's asked me to ask you this, and now's Terry. Terry's up there, Terry wants me to ask you this. And I would press that saw, and why the Conservative Party, as you say, is not, I think, in my opinion, making more of the winter fuel thing, which is the easiest to explain, got the largest cut through, and I think the most difficult thing to defend and justify, because I still can't understand how they think they're going to make a saving when the Labour admits themselves that if everyone who deserves pension credit gets it, will actually then evaporate any savings that could be made. Well, ultimately, I think this is just the open goal, the open sore that should be prodded, because I think Labour did make an immoral and cruel and callous decision on this particular issue, and there was other pots of funding out there where they easily could have found £1.5 billion, which I'm still sceptical is what they would have saved overall.
Even if it is, even if there's discrepancies, £1.5 billion from your pensioners and your farmers, which has been a total PR disaster. You put, and you're a defender of capitalism, you put corporation tax up by 1%, you bring in £7 billion. You've got more than 3 times that amount, and you're not annoying electoral groups that you can't actually afford to annoy, because one thing we know about older people, they vote, and they will go and vote in their droves at the next election because of this. You don't want to annoy the farmers, because we've just won a load of rural seats we've not won since 1997, and they're going to go to the wire as well. So it makes... Again, I go back to the fact it's Treasury brain. This is a policy idea, but we've not thought about the optics, we've not thought about the politics, the communications and everything else.
Well, to come back, just before we go to the break, there's this great image that was produced by Steve Swinford on X today, trying to make sense of the 3 foundations, 5 missions and 6 milestones that will be coming up on screen very shortly. Here we go. We've got this image here. Now, for all the bedwetters out there, this is a joke. Okay, this is the chart from Steve Swinford. It's just meant to be a bit of a laugh, but look, how anyone understands this, and how anyone expects civil servants, politicians to understand this, is having a laugh at themselves. So for those of you listening on radio, we've got here arrows pointing, and I can't tell you how many different directions, all across a wide range. We've got the 3 foundations, which sit on, then above that's the 5 missions, and then above that is then the 6 milestones in which we're all going to be governed by. If you see this image, you get time when you're home to go on Stephen Swinford's Twitter, please do go and have a look. But if Labour don't understand what a comms crisis they're facing, if Labour don't understand by what they've done today, all they've managed to do is create more confusion, more chaos, more uncertainty, and quite frankly, looking like they're doing more dithering and delaying.